they'll say Sharia in a Sharia or fiqh variation, completely meaningless. Fiqh is an instrumentality. And it's an instrumentality. It's epistemological principles, and as well as various interpretive principles that allow you to engage the transcendental norms of goodness. Now, fiqh, though, as a mechanic, as an engagement, as a process, cannot rest on. It is not represented by a text. It's represented by rational or by textual principles. So principles of how you read, how you try to make meaning of something, principles of that understands language, principles. If you have a word, do you prefer the Arabic? Do you prefer the Yemeni context of that word, or do you prefer the Najdi context, or do you prefer the Hijazi context, or do you prefer the context of what's today Iraq, Basra, or Kufa? These are all within the principles of fiqh, because it could make a huge difference what nuance of the word you're using. And so we have many principles that regulate what text can be understood in what context, principles of pedagogy and philology, and so on and so forth. Now, what comes out of fiqh is what we call ahkam, positive commandments. And these positive commandments in themselves could be, they're after having engaged the transcendental divine norms through a systematic methodology of interpretation and comprehension, which could include rational and intuitive as well as textual methodologies. You distill this sort of when I was young, I would often see the way my family in Egyptian villages would clean. There's no context for it, but a lot of corn and rice in Egyptian villages is very dirty, and you need to sort of pick it and distill it and produce. So it often reminds me of that. What comes out of it is a proposition. Now, in itself, that proposition is not mandatory. It is not obligatory in itself. It is a claim, a proposition about what fiqh produced as a result of the engagement with Sharia, and that proposition needs various sets of procedural rules to either be mulzim, i.e. obligatory, or ghayr mulzim. The mulzim is what is obligatory, and ghayr mulzim is what is not obligatory. Not obligatory, not in the spiritual sense, but in the positive legalistic sense. So if a judge, a duly authorized judge in a jurisdiction, judge who's appointed, etc., adopts a legal proposition and enforces it, that becomes a mulzim. But if as a proposition itself, what the instrument that would make it binding for me or not outside the judiciary and government that is legitimately constructed would be my conscience. That's it. What we call damir. In other words, let's say 6 jurists. These 6 jurists use fiqh. they look all at what the construct of Sharia, and they come up with 6 different propositions. Which of these propositions is binding on me? Well, it might need the state to say, well, this is the law that you will obey. But let's assume the absence of the state. As Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, said, the state is completely unnecessary. Which of these becomes binding on me? It is ultimately what my conscience considers to be binding. This gave rise to a further debate in Islamic jurisprudential tradition about, well, how could all 6 opinions be right at the same time? Does God actually have a preferred opinion? Does God, say, well, one of these is right and the others are wrong, but I just choose not to tell you till the final day? Or is it that all 6 are right? And that's a long philosophical discourse. Now, all of this, however, doesn't touch upon an initial question which is at the heart of any meaningful discourse on Sharia, and one where the real challenge for contemporary Muslims lies. What is the source of obligation? What is, in Islamic tradition we say, what is the source of taklif? The fact that there are divine norms, the fact that there is an epistemology and methodology to apprehend and comprehend the divine norms, the fact that there is a state that can adopt law or not, none of this in itself can tell me that there is a legitimate obligation incumbent upon me to execute. Where does that obligation come from? Well, if you read a book by Khaled Abou El Fadl, for instance, who was a judge and a Mu'tazili thinker, a rationalist among the rationalist school, Khaled Abou El Fadl wrote 8 amazing philosophical volumes on the source of taklif, on what is legal, what is an obligation, differentiating between moral obligations, legal obligations, social obligations, cultural obligations, and so on and so forth. And that's a very rich, long tradition, not just in Islam, but later on in natural law discourses and so on and so forth. And then in contemporary law, of course, we talk about obligation all the time. But there are there are primary attitudes to the issue of obligation. If we forget all the theories, if we forget all the philosophical arguments in the schools of thought, I counted at one time in my own, as 24 different philosophies of obligation that disagreed on serious theological and philosophical issues. But we can discern 2 main orientations. One that looks at the source of obligation as the will of the divine in commanding an act, and only the will of the divine in commanding an act. If you do not have proof of the order, the command that comes from the divine, then we cannot say you have a taklif, an obligation. The second says that could be used as evidence of obligation, but it is not the source of obligation. The source of obligation is in the fundamental, primordial principles of goodness themselves. So that it is, put it bluntly, it is not something is good because God tells you to do it, but if God tells you to do it because it's good. Now, in both of these, the critical issue for the contemporary Muslim is to what extent, whatever their theory, their philosophy of obligation is, to what extent does the drawing upon the divine norms to argue for any type of determinable social order. I mean, how extensive the social order, how detailed the social order, how much it covers, all of that. But to what extent does it exhaust, or does it exhaust at all, the space for the human conscience and the human intellect? If one says that it completely exhausts the space for the human conscience and the human intellect, then I would argue that, in fact, it is a circular negation of the very idea of Sharia itself. That the divine norms themselves become meaningless. That if there is no space to look that fundamental, put it differently, fundamental part of the transcendent good is the use of the intellect and is the use of the conscience. And if you're precluded from using it, then the whole journey towards or from Sharia becomes meaningless. The other approach, which says, well, no, it's enough that we can, something tells us that this originates from some divine source, and once we know that, any role for the intellect or the social conscience or the individual conscience has been depleted. In other words, it's unnecessary. That is what is the most problematic in some of the constructions of Sharia today. Now, let me put this in an important context, though. This tradition, sometimes graduate students come to my home and they see volumes and volumes and volumes about on various aspects of Sharia, and they say, well, why do you have so many volumes? I say, well, because they don't all say the same thing. If they all said the same thing, that wouldn't need so many volumes, right? And so you have a literary, or you have if you will, a civilizational context in which people debated these ideas. So, for instance, even someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, who is now sort of the prized trophy of Wahhabi Islam and so on. But Ibn Taymiyyah, if you read his response to Greek logicians, which was translated by Wa'il Hallaq, it's actually, it shows you the extent to which these theories, these arguments, were living, breathing, viable issues among